I think that it's also not a sort of zero-sum thing, meaning that you can be lacking in everything. You can retreat from being willing to be mighty and productive, and at the same time, you can retreat from any value placed on real wisdom or on beauty, and you also at the same time can have a corrupted relationship or a severed relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I think when you don't have Shem, Cham, or Yafet aboard, that spells doom. And you can do better by adding, back any amount of, not any amount, but like some amount of each of those, because you need some of them. And then it becomes more complex, whether you're disposing them in the right way. Because I think what's interesting is that in what you're describing, if you take, for example, the West's retreat from belief in the positive value of its own might, especially in the latter half of the 20th century and going forward, into the recent decades, clearly, you could say that's kind of a diminution of the element of Cham in things. And in some ways, maybe that's, not always a bad thing, meaning the humility to say, or the sort of ethical restraint to say, might doesn't just make right. And this isn't just a situation where I should take whatever power I can gain and use it to subjugate and exploit the rest of the world, right? Crime is also hugely about exploitation. That's what Mitzrayim was about, is like use power to exploit the people at the bottom of the pyramid, and you can benefit the top of the pyramid. So you could make some kind of narrow and naive argument for saying, oh, well, Ham is bad because Ham is about exploitation and Ham is about, enslavement and all of these things that we don't like, or is about the cruelty and the bullying and the coercion and everything else that when we think of it being done to ourselves, we don't like the idea of it. And so then we say, okay, so maybe we can do without it. But then, of course, you simply can't do without it completely. Like no civilization, no society has ever thrived and persisted if it was unwilling to do basic things to make people afraid to try to take it over or to conquer it or to destroy it, right? You need to project a certain amount of force. And yeah, I think one of the things that's clearly happened in the West is that there's been this ideological lapse in willingness to project force, not completely, but certainly, in comparison to previous eras. And that does, both at the level of, as you referenced, domestic border, and also at the level of international relations or matters of security across borders and everything else. So yeah, you need at least a bit of Cham, and it needs to be disposed in the right way with respect to the standards by which you judge when it's appropriate to use that kind of power. And then at the same time, as you point out in the West, there's been a real corrosion of the Yafet aspect, right? Which is like an easy connection to make in this case because of how much the Western university system was explicitly based on, in part, prizing the heritage of Greco-Roman civilization, which is very much that of Yafet. And so, it used to be, it was easier to find that kind of anchor point of how we decide what is a good idea and what is knowledge worth learning for its own sake and everything else in the West. And that has really gotten scrambled in recent generations. And so I think it's fair to say that Yafet has been draining out as well. And it just, none of it looks good because it's also an era where there's been a lot of turn away from the idea that there's one God who made the world and it's the God of Israel and all these things that the mightiest civilizations of the last few centuries were willing to attest to, even if they didn't like Jews very much at the same time, always. They nonetheless were willing at least to attest to that. And now there's a lot less of that you see from people who hold the reins of power as well. So I don't know if you can turn that around or whether you just say, okay, who's next? Like who now has the viable combination of Shem, Chan, and Yafet if that's not something that's being maintained in the West. But I think, for Westerners who want to be more optimistic, then they would look at Yonah and Nineveh and say, no, it's possible to do tshuva and it's possible to get a shot in the arm and top up the level of commitment to each of these things in order to make a civilization viable again.